And we're live. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Secure Developer. For those who don't know, we're an inclusive community that hopes to educate and enable developers in application security. This session will be a panel discussion on the state of open source security, moderated by Simon Maple. Before we get started, I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. So I'm Sam, and I'm the community manager here at Snyk, and hopefully the person working behind the scenes to make this all happen. So really hope you enjoyed today's session, and if you've got any feedback, please let me know. If you're not signed up to the Slack channel, Slack is the best way to facilitate questions for today. So if you've got any questions and you're not on the Slack, just pop onto thesecuredeveloper.com. The top right-hand corner, you'll see join, and it'll give you all the information on joining Slack. And if you can join the live sessions channel, you can ask the questions in there, and we'll get them over to Simon for today. The other thing to do is in your bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a little cog. If you can up your resolution to maximum, it'll be the best way to view today's session. I think that's it from me. We'd love you to share. So you can follow us on Twitter at @thesecuredev or as said on the website. And this session will be posted on the website after today. I think that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Simon to get everything ready.
Thank you very much, Sam. And yeah, please do click that cog, because if you do not click that cog, then you will not see Liran's hat in full HD. So we'll come to that in just a second. So yeah, first of all, the State of Open Source Security is a report which really came from a number of different sources, which we'll talk about in just a second. I'm Simon Maple. Let's talk a little bit about who we have on the panel first. I'm Simon Maple. I'll just be moderating and facilitating this chat. As Sam mentioned in the live session chat on Slack, there you can post all your questions, and I'll put that to the panel. We also have a number of questions that I can kick off with. Please do also make sure you have the report in front of you. It's this beautiful handcrafted report that was released only a couple of weeks ago. Whole bunch of lovely graphs and interesting information in there. So download that report as well. And what we'll try and do is we'll try and mention the page number so you can read along with us as we go. So who am I? I'm one of the DevRels here at Snyk as well. And I helped with the report a little bit, but the vast majority of this report was done by Liran. So let me introduce Liran Tal. Liran Tal is a developer advocate at Snyk. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, Liran.
So yeah, I joined Snyk a couple of months ago. Been really happy with the ride so far, and the report has been immensely insightful on building that. So thank you, Simon, for all the help with that as well. Just a bit of background for me. I've been doing a lot of security around the Node and JavaScript Foundation through the Node Foundation itself, actually, and the Node ecosystem too. I've been also advocate for OWASP through the Node Go project, which I'm a current contributor to helping raise awareness on that project, and have doubled on writing Node.js security. So kind of been doing security for the last couple of years a little bit more intensely than I've done before.
Awesome, thank you, Liran, and welcome to the session. Also, we have Bertucio, who is a product marketing manager and very, very knowledgeable about security as well on the Google Cloud platform. So, Anne, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Like Simon said, I'm on the Trust and Security product team at Google Cloud Platform, but I specifically focus on container security. Prior to Google, I worked for a few years at the OpenStack Foundation on staff there, and I managed the Kata Containers project and was on the release management team for the OpenStack project, which, if you're not familiar, it's open source cloud infrastructure and one of the larger open source projects in the world. So that's a little bit about me.
Awesome, thank you. And finally, but by no means least, we have Josh Grossman, who is team leader and senior application security consultant at Comsec and an OWASP Israel board member. So welcome, Josh. Tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started.
Yeah, so like you said, my name is Josh Grossman. I work as an application security consultant. I've been doing that for several years now. That means my day job is generally going in, breaking clients' applications, and then helping them to fix them afterwards. But I also spend a fair amount of time advising them generally on secure application architecture and secure development as well. So sort of more earlier stage, sort of the shifting left style. Like you say, I'm a member of the OWASP Israel board, and I'm one of the organizers of the OWASP Global AppSec Tel Aviv conference, which is coming up at the end of May over here in sunny Israel. So that should be great fun.
Awesome. That sounds awesome. Yeah. And so where can we find more information about that?
So the
just to put you on the spot.
Sorry?
Just to put you on the spot.
So I think actually if you go to appsec.eu, I think that actually redirects to our conference website at the moment.
Oh,
yes, it does. So that's nice and simple. What if I can put that in the chat as well?
I do like the AppSec conferences, so that's definitely one that people should look at.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So without further ado, let's first jump in, and Liran, as the author of the report, why don't you give us a quick overview about some of the highlights, some of the things that really stood out for you from the State of Open Source Security report?
Sure. What report is that?
This is the JVM report. Oh, no, sorry, no, this is the security report. That's right.
It's not the Java one. Okay. All right. So, yeah, I think you kind of tried to give an intro on that. And I think it's important to also highlight that what I really like about this report is that we managed to bring in like several perspectives of, open source security. One of them being like the human side of it through kind of having a survey and asking maintainers and developers, how do they take in security, what kind of stuff do they do around it, etc. And there was the data side of it, which is also kind of built like around several layers. So it's application security, and then OS library security, and that kind of reflected into Docker, which was an interesting piece of information that we found out through building it. So some key takeaways, I think, are if we take a look at the amount of application vulnerabilities that got disclosed, we're seeing around as put that into a timeline. So the number almost doubled over the last 2 years just for application vulnerabilities being disclosed. And if you take a look at the same graph, the same kind of period graph over timeline for system libraries vulnerabilities, you would see the same trend, right? So we're seeing vulnerabilities kind of jumping in that sense as well. And that gave us insight into finding out that when we looked into Docker 10 most popular that are appearing just there on the Docker Hub website, just scanning them, we find out that each and every one of them has at least 30 vulnerabilities found for each of those. And I'm not sure like a lot of people really understood the impact of that. And when we even dived into a little bit deeper into what kind of vulnerabilities are those, or well, you found a vulnerability, what can you do about it? So this is a piece of data that we found out from Snyk data, which is also kind of insightful around just figuring out that the fact of out of all the scanned Docker images that we found, you could 44% out of all of those, you could just fix them by or at least lower the amount of vulnerabilities found in them just by updating your base image tag. So just moving from an Ubuntu to Ubuntu Slim or something like that would just lower the amount of vulnerabilities. Just 20% of those Docker images, if you just rebuild them, just get, even you're on the same image tag, but those image tags get built all the time. So if you would just rebuild it more often, and you would not have some kind of long-lived Docker container out there, you would get a lot of benefit out of lowering your vulnerabilities. So we got into, I think, this very insightful kind of pieces of information. And I think some other really key takeaways were from the human side of how people take security. So one thing we noticed is maintainers have good intent or into being security aware. So for example, when we asked developers how do they feel about owning the open source security of what they built, right? Their application and stuff like that. So 81% of them want to own security. And I think that's an amazing number, very positively impacting the fact that I think all of the work that everyone here on this panel are involved in is kind of taking shape, and the awareness and engagement is out there and is working. When we asked them about taking the responsibility of their Docker images, which is I think not a less astonishing number, is 68% of them feel that they should own that as well, which is even more insightful in terms of showing how DevOps is really working in terms of the developer teams and stuff like that. A little bit to contrast that is, while I think maintainers and developers have those good intentions of owning security, we're seeing still that 37% of them are not implementing any kind of security testing on their CIs and their build systems. Half of them are not implementing any kind of Docker image security testing. So there's like a bit of there's like the good and bad into this. There's a good intent in being there and taking ownership, but I think we still need a lot of tooling and culture and helping developers and maintainers kind of embrace security a lot more into what they do, into their streamlined workflows and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, and it sounds so much more believable when a Jedi Master says it as well. So some really interesting takeaways there, and some very interesting stats, which are both from what I understand from a survey that was given, as well as data which has been mined, so data that exists out today as well. So let's take a deeper dive into some of those, and let's start with Josh. One of the key takeaways there, which Liran mentioned, was that we've seen an 88% increase in the number of the number of vulnerabilities, application library vulnerabilities, over just 2 years. We've almost doubled in a couple of years. What do you think the main drivers are of this? Is it the open source growth? Is it more of a focus on security? What is your kind of view, and maybe even some of the insights that you can maybe grab from OWASP as well?
Yeah, I think you make a couple of very good points there. I mean, first of all, the growth, the exponential growth of how many libraries there are that are available, how many organizations are now taking advantage of these libraries, and I think also the increased awareness. Ultimately, we're seeing an increase in how many vulnerabilities have been discovered. That doesn't necessarily mean an increase in how many vulnerabilities are actually there to begin with. So I think that in some ways that's a good sign that the vulnerabilities are being found. At the same time, the whole sort of open source library ecosystem does bring very significant challenges because of this. I mean, ultimately there are vulnerabilities caused by, I suppose, coding errors. But also very concerning is the sort of the deliberate supply chain poisoning, whereby either a malicious developer is inserting something not desirable into a library that then gets put into a large piece of software, or alternatively a developer's account is getting taken over, and then that malicious code is being put in. So I think it's certainly a growing problem, and we're definitely seeing as well that to a certain extent developers are aware of this issue and they are trying to find ways to deal with it. I hope that slowly developers will start to have a better understanding of what libraries they're actually using, where the libraries are actually coming from. I do even wonder whether we're going to start seeing a move towards some sort of trusted registries. I mean, right now there tend to be a few very, very large but completely open registries, and I wonder whether companies will start looking into, okay, can I get a trusted registry where it doesn't have everything, but I know that whatever's in there I can rely on, that someone's looked at it. I mean,
do you think about a private trusted registry, or a registry that just has greater governance around it?
So my thought is that if a company is big enough, then I guess it can stand up its own private trusted registry. That obviously requires a company of a certain size. Alternatively, it may be a third party that says, okay, look, we're going to stand up our registry and we're going to allow other companies to use it, and we offer certain guarantees or certain assurance over this registry that companies can then feel a little bit more comfortable than just sort of doing an NPM install and hoping for the best, I guess.
Which is interesting when we contrast, say, NPM and Maven, actually, because of course, when we think about the malicious packages, we see them more on the NPM registries than the Maven registries, right? So, and do you think the solution to this exists on the registry side, or do you think it's more on the on the developer side?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest things, to Josh's point about we're seeing an increase in open source growth in general and kind of a normalization of it, is that we need to encourage people to be informed consumers. Everyone is going to have a slightly different trust model, security profile, a different approach to whether that means I need to host my own private registry or I need to establish a trusted registry. But I think the thing, I saw the 88%, for example, and I think it's worth emphasizing that there can be vulnerabilities in both open source and proprietary software, and we shouldn't be afraid of these big numbers. They can mean a lot of things. Josh, I think you just hit it on the nose with disclosure is not the same as existence. But I think, as people bring in open source, you have to remember you can't just git clone and walk away. You need to know where in this community do they disclose vulnerabilities? Where do I need to be to make sure when a patch comes out, I'm getting it? Finding those communication lines, I think that's something that's really important as people journey into the open source world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
go ahead.
So no, please go on.
There's an interesting insight on that with regards to known vulnerabilities in what's kind of unknown, and I think we kind of found something kind of related to that in the report, which is we tracked a couple of very high high-profile packages on NPM and the security disclosures that were for them, and we found that security vulnerability actually existed in the code for like almost 2.5 years. Until it was disclosed, found and fixed and everything, and that was like the median time for it. And the worst time was like almost 6 years. The quickest time was almost 1 year. So it's kind of relating to what Josh and Anne are saying. These are only the known vulnerabilities. It doesn't mean that there's so many stuff that we probably don't know yet, and will get discovered. And just like a point on proprietary. Closed source stuff like that is I was at a college actually discussing this insights from the vulnerability with students for a cyber major degree, and one of them was asking me, do we know how do we feel about open source in terms of security versus closed source, meaning kind of I think. Taking a look at what Eric Raymond said about Linux and stuff like that, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So, would we assume? I think that kind of we assume that as we use open source software because it's just out there and people are seeing it, more people are seeing it. We would find those security vulnerabilities maybe much quicker. But I'm not really sure, I don't think we have exact numbers of that or research on that specific, closed versus open source security. I don't know, I just kind of poking the discussion around this if you want to share on that.
I think in terms of the open versus closed source, I think that the many eyes assumes that the many eyes are actually looking. And I think that's definitely something we see. I mean, look at it's not directly related, but if you look at something like the OpenSSL bugs or something that were there for many years, and that was always open source, but just no one was looking at that particular point.
Exactly.
But at the same time, certainly closed source just means we don't necessarily know about it, but we do know that, right. For example, look at I don't know, Adobe or Java, software that isn't really thought of as open source, but you see update after update after update for security bugs after security bugs. So certainly no less for a problem. I guess on the plus side with the open source, it is possible to see it. I think something interesting that Anne mentioned about finding out about the findings and finding out about vulnerabilities. I think one statistic from the report that jumped out at me was I think a quarter of I think 27% of the users said they just wouldn't find out about vulnerabilities. They didn't have a way they'd find out about vulnerabilities, and I think 17% of maintainers as well. So given that, I suppose my assumption is that people who are filling out the surveys for this would have been relatively security minded, because I suppose they're engaging with a survey from a security company. Mm-hmm. I felt those percentages were slightly alarmingly high. They had sort of no way they felt like they would find out about vulnerabilities.
Mm. And moving it to more of the company side, so obviously you have a lot of experience on the kind of product side, product managers, that kind of area. already knowing about these known vulnerabilities that exist, if we more focus on the open source kind of side, knowing about these vulnerabilities, what about the challenges or awareness among the company and among the team in terms of dealing with, prioritizing, triaging any kind of application security issues as part of the ownership in the delivery of a library or a project or an application? How do you see that balance?
Yeah, actually, we just hosted the Container Security Summit here at Google a couple of weeks ago, and Ian Coldwater was our closing keynote. And her talk, probably in the breadth of her talks, is one of her less technical ones, but it was so impactful because her whole point was that the best security tool you have is communication with your security teams. And she's kind of put it half on. The security people we're a little cranky. We dress in all black. We're not always known to be nervous. And it scares off people who are in product, people are devs, that you really need to have those lines of communication. That needs to be your best friend, essentially, because when a patch comes in, when a disclosure comes in, those are the people who are probably seeing it first. And that's how you're going to find out that information, is having that line straight to those security teams. And I think, Liran, you were mentioning about those shift left stats, or maybe Josh was, and I think that's something we should definitely dive into, the difference between, I think sometimes people in shifting left, they are using responsibility on the developer interchangeably with moving security checks earlier in your development lifecycle. I think those are two very different things. And I think we have to be fair to our developers about expectations on, am I asking you to be an expert in both my application and security? That's a lot to put on one team. Or am I just moving my checks earlier so you put those security guardrails in place? And I think, Simon, I just took your question all over the place.
No, I think this is really interesting, particularly because, you mentioned communication, which is incredibly important, but it's equally one of the hardest things, right? I mean, we can add whatever tooling, we can add whatever processes we want, and things like that, get followed. But when it's literally one person on, maybe a few meters away from another person sitting at an office, at their desks, getting people even that close to communicate is hard. It's not an easy thing, and I guess this is where the DevOps movements, the DevSecOps movements, where trying to engage people from different silos and getting them to talk is really key to fixing this problem.
Absolutely. I mean, I think forever, the relationship between security and devs, that security people who say no, they tell the developers, please stop doing that, don't do that, and we have to kind of change the understanding and the conversation to be, no, I'm telling you not to do this, for the benefit of this whole team, this whole organization.
Okay, we have to follow up. Sorry, Josh.
So I was going to say, I suppose I thought, following on from that, the ideal really is that the security people are coming in and saying, yes, you can do that, but let's try and find a way of making that more a secure process. Or like Anne says, it's very much about not being the department of no and about the department of yes, but let's sort of have a conversation about this, which again sort of circles back to the communication point.
We have a couple of questions actually following on. One actually following on from the previous discussion, which is actually pretty interesting as well. So I will go back to that one, and then one about this current one. So when we talked about the differences between open source and closed source, is there a downside of using open source software? Because once a vulnerability is known in open source software, there are obviously targets all around that are still using software app versions with known vulnerabilities in. Are the targets bigger as a result of that?
Well, I think this, and sorry, maybe I'll start, and Josh, I'm sure you have heaps of opinions on this one as well. I think this goes to the importance of knowing where those communication channels are. I think there's not a lot of general understanding about how the open source disclosure and patching process works. And so, for example, if you use a distro, those distributions are on an embargoed list to get that patch early. So if you're consuming something from a distro, you kind of have this shared responsibility model, and it is on the user to understand, is my distro patching me? Do I need to be responsible for the patch? And that gets to being on those lists, understanding where those announcements come through. But you have some time to patch right away. But then if you let something go and you sit on it, yes, you do become, I think that's one of the quickest things that attackers can look for is, is there, the CV has been out for a long time, it's a privask or something that I can really get to. I'm going to go straight there. It's kind of an easy target. So that 27% in the report who are not getting information about vulnerabilities, go get on those security announce lists right away.
And is it reasonable to jump on that many security vulnerability kind of mailing lists? Because we see people with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of transitives and direct dependencies. Can we rely just on that?
I think actually that's the joy of this ecosystem that's come up around like Snyk, is that there are a lot. If I'm pulling in heaps of tools and they all have open source announce lists, that is a lot to manage. But we have this whole ecosystem, like tools like Snyk that are putting it in one place for you. You also have things like Claire. It's a CVE, essentially a database of what's coming in through CVEs, so people can use that to scan against. So there's a lot of tools to help you out. You don't have to feel like I'm scanning through, new email announce lists every single day.
Okay, cool. And one follow-up question as well around, this was actually a DM that came in. So Josh, we were talking about the differences in communicate, the hard part of people communicating, but communication being such an important thing. When we have separate separate security teams, obviously that's an extra level of communication, not just within developers. And we try to deploy, say, 3 times a day, multiple times a day. It's the flavor of the month, right? How many times can you deploy a week or a day? Is having a separate security team still valid? Or is this just making the problem harder for us?
I think there's always going to be a need for the security specialists to sort of living and breathing that. I mean, definitely, security is this whole industry. There's a lot going on all the time. It's something that's very difficult to just keep track of, sort of as a side note. But at the same time, I think it's very important to firstly have the communication with the development teams, have the close relationship with the development teams, and ideally sort of identify who on development teams is more security minded and may be able to act as a liaison or as an ambassador for security within the software group itself. I've seen examples where the security people there's a full-time security person, but he reports to the manager of the development team. He'll sit in a separate security office or security department. He sits within the development team alongside the developers, but he's a dedicated security person. Another model is to have a central security body, but each security person has responsibility for a few products, and they will therefore be the contact for those different products. So I think it's about how that communication happens and about how you identify who are the people who can really help. So I was doing this as a secondment internally at a company, and I identified that obviously QA was going to be a big part of this, because if we want people to find bugs such as security bugs, then QA is a good place to start. And I was talking to the head of QA, and I made sure I made time to speak to him and sort of talk to him about what I was planning and what I was thinking about, and how I could help him do security testing without making his life more difficult. And along the way, he said, "Oh yeah, I've got this guy on my team who really likes automated testing. He's also really interested in security as well." So I think there's definitely the need for the sort of security specialist, but they can't exist in an ivory tower completely separated. They have to have that direct line into development teams as well.
I think this ties into kind of the whole shift left kind of thing, right? Because it's like, if you think of security, it's a cross-cutting concern for applications, right? It's just like performance and accessibility and stuff like that. And it's kind of, it's one of those things, maybe a more important thing, depending on opinions, but it's one of those things where I think, like Anne said before, you're not gonna get developers to be the ultimate security expert as well as developers. I mean, if you have that on the team, it's amazing, but that's probably not gonna be a stats around everyone. But still, just having this awareness, I think this is kind of what a shift left is all about from security as well. It's kind of getting the awareness out. So even if you have some kind of tooling, it's gonna go along just at some point still. And there are other aspects of it, right? Like code reviews is something that you generally don't need tooling for, or it could help, but it's enough to just have the awareness of it. So just watching a code review between two developers, talking about something, and it's not just a functional kind of bug discussion. It's also where, well, maybe this is something that's going to get user input, and could that be malicious? Should we trust it? Should we not? What should we do about it? There's a lot about awareness, I think, that goes in there. that is, as far as I see it, the moment that developers are asking those questions, that's, for me, it's like 50% win. Because at that point, I know that they're going to be very much aware for it. They're going to be very much committed to it, and like they want to be secure. They want to, they want to have, this kind of ownership. And it's not going to say that they're going to own the tools and connect everything, etc., and be the security expert for it. But it's a very long way, I think, from the not being aware of it at all, not taking any kind of ownership for it.
And
to be honest, I was really surprised by that 81% figure of responsibility on developers. I thought that was astonishingly high. I just assumed maybe there were a lot of, I don't know, DevOps people or development managers or something who felt like, okay, we'll just put it on the developers. I thought that was really high. I think we talk about shift left, but to be honest, I'm sitting here thinking maybe that it's more about spreading left rather than shifting left, because we want security at every stage, not just at a particular stage. Ultimately, like I say, that 81% figure is very strange. I think that security isn't everyone's job, but it does need to be everyone needs to have some responsibility for it, and it needs to have some sort of awareness of it, and that will come from the architect, from the developers, from the QA, from the DevOps people that come all the way through the chain. And I think, to me, maybe the concept of shifting left is about saying, okay, well, this is now a concern at every stage of the process, and therefore everyone needs to be thinking about it. And if a developer says, oh, I've got this security bug that I need to deal with, or I've got this particular problem where I need a security architect to look at this feature because it's quite dangerous, then once we know that, okay, security is now covering every stage of the life cycle, developers more likely to have that buy-in to get permission to say, yes, you can now go and spend 2 days working on this, or you can engage a security architect to look at this. So I think that's really sort of where shift left has to come to spread it across the entire process.
And I think, Josh, you were talking about from security, the answer is not no, but it's yes and. And I think we have to encourage our developers to look at their security tools the same way. So for example, like on Google Cloud, we have this tool called binary authorization, and it's essentially deploy time gating, based on parameters that your organization has decided for you. So for some reason, bin auth were to say, nope, you can't do that. It should be looked at as, for the developer, this is a flag, this is a good warning. This is not frustration, this is not no, this is something is up and I need to take a look. I think I see a lot when you look at what is one of the second most searched things when you search for SE Linux is how do I turn SE Linux off? And I think that's to me it's always kind of like a flag of people are not looking for this is a warning, I should be saying what's up. It's how do I get rid of this as quickly as possible? So I think we need to have the same open mindset to tools, whether it's results I'm seeing in scanning or a tool like binauth. These are our friends. This tooling is our friend.
And the number, the 81% that we mentioned, that number was actually a multiple choice question, and that people chose developers more than any other answer put together, which was really interesting. So from the shift left point of view, Liran, you're a developer. You write, you're an application developer, and you also write Node. Well, when we think about shifting left, are we actually just pushing too much onto a developer? How much more can a developer take? I remember when I started, it was people worked in development, people worked in test, people worked in operations, people worked in security, right? Now developers are doing more and more unit tests, more and more functional tests, more of the operations and checking in code, infrastructure as code. Now doing more and more security. Where does it stop? Are we putting too much onto developers? Where's the break for the developer?
Right. So Simon, when you do Node, it's very easy. So as opposed to Java, for example, it gives you a lot of spare time to do performance and UX and all those things. All right, cool. So I think it's a good question, right? Because you could ask that exactly about all of these other coding concerns and all the examples that you gave. And I think in general, the idea is that we're also having a lot of awareness around it, but then tooling that helps us. And I think developers want to do the right thing and build it the right way. This goes a long way into educating them into how to do things. So if you would give developers, this is secure coding guidelines, I think they would want to follow it and not say, I don't have time to do this. And I think that as we are going into delivering in a very, very fast way, and delivering value to our customers and delivering products very fast, which is important, to the business or whatever basically you're doing on. It's also important to not let go of quality, and quality is not just testing; it's also security. It's also other aspect of the app. So I don't think it's something that is requiring too much of them. I think it's requiring their attention in general for developers to do it, because I think like Anne and Josh said before, we're going to have security teams there. We're going to have security experts that we can consult with. And, just like you have an architect for general, software design, you would have that for security, and maybe for some organization for performance, there would be tech leads for security. So I don't think, everyone on the team has to be, 120% knowledgeable on security aspects. But usually you do have those tech leads on development teams. One is a very UI tech lead oriented, so he would know a lot about performance optimization and stuff like that. Someone else might be a security tech lead around for that whole team, and he could be someone who would mentor other team members and be involved in code reviews. So I think it's kind of a shared effort throughout developer teams, and I think it's an amazing kind of incubation part where also team members or tech leads and seniors and juniors kind of mentor each other and share that knowledge. So I think that's a pretty reasonable asks.
And there's a great point that's just been made in the live session from Mark Stevenson. So please, anyone with comments and questions, do jump into the live session. Mark says that's interesting, but if you're a small company, the developer has to wear many hats, right? And maybe there isn't a dedicated security team. Plus, to add to that question, I would say you're often, with the smaller companies, more likely to release more often, perhaps, than some of the bigger companies that are maybe more traditional in terms of their deployment flow. Any from the panel? Anyone want to add into that?
I would say I think that's where you're probably leaning on some of your automated security tooling heavier than in other places. We've referred to them, you're putting in scanners, I'm putting in gating tools like Benoth that I was talking about. If you don't have many actual hands, you have to kind of have those automated hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And staying with you, there's a project that you work on called, I may say this wrong, is it Kata or Kata?
Kata containers.
Yeah, of course. I was just
testing it.
The Kata
if you remember how it's called.
Yeah, that's right. So the Kata Containers project. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that is and how that helps people find, understand about the security issues as early as possible?
And also, which story do you get if you win the Kata?
If you win the Kata. Well, I'll explain Kata Containers, and maybe I confused you with some of the other tooling we have. So Kata Containers is an open source project. It was started by Intel and HyperSH. Hyper's a startup out of China. Intel had Clear Containers, and they were both kind of looking at virtualized containers. So how can I add a second layer of isolation? I think the mistake from, technically my title's in marketing, so marketer here. The mistake container world has made was using all those images of shipping containers and really telling people that, containers really contain, everything's fine. I think we maybe oversold a little bit what that containment really means. And so there's a big movement in the container security world around isolation. So how can I have defense in depth? How can I have more than just relying on my namespaces and C groups to isolate those workloads? So Kata Containers is essentially putting a lightweight VM around your container through their own runtime that they have. And so it's an OCI compliant runtime. And that micro VM approach is one thing you see, like AWS Firecracker kind of come out with that micro VM approach. There's another open source project out of Google called gvisor. And rather than going a micro VM, they're looking at how can I support kind of low IO but highly scaled applications who maybe don't need that micro VM approach. And so what they're actually doing, they have a user space kernel that's got kind of a set suite of syscalls that it can and can't have. And so that's where you can have kind of that rapid performance, but get a second layer of isolation. So there's a lot happening in that space. There's also Nobla containers. So a lot of people experimenting in the open source world with isolation right now.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of from the open source maintainer point of view, What are the biggest wins for an open source maintainer for using these?
I think for a maintainer, it's really, they're much more end user products. Mm-hmm. So, if you are a maintainer, you could be running your applications in them. You could be, looking at them if I want to secure my projects that I'm hosting somewhere. But they're much more end user results.
Okay, cool. And when we think about other containers, the report found, Liran, that the top 10 most popular Docker images contain at least 30 vulnerabilities. And Node was the clear winner on that one, Liran. Was that surprising to you? Is this kind of like something that people tend not to realize when they're using containers? What's the story with this?
Yeah, I think it's so it had a considerably large amount of vulnerabilities inside, something like 580, if I remember the number right, as opposed to the others. So I actually think that we fixed it on the Node Foundation side and using now a different image. At least there's a whole discussion around that on the issue queue. But even regardless of that, I think there's a lot of misconception or just maybe lack of knowledge where people might be doing. I know as for myself, before I went into Snyk, I was a developer and a team leader. And my team also had maintained their own Docker file and stuff like that, and we used to do from node :10, etc. And the classic examples where we're building on our app on foundation of some kind of OS or distribution, but we didn't even had this kind of this awareness into what we are bringing in with ourselves. And I think that this is something that we talk a lot in terms of the Stack Overflow problem, where people go in, they copy paste from Node.10 or some other kind of vulnerable code, and it works, but there's no deeper understanding into what exactly is it doing, or what exactly are the risks of doing something that way. So I think it's easy for teams to make those kind of mistakes as they lack that deeper knowledge into what goes into that. I think maybe Anne wants to jump on it, as I think she's nodding in a lot of.
I'm nodding in agreement and jumping up. Yeah, it's I think was it 2017 or 18? Kind of those crypto mining Docker images that we saw. I think there's this assumption, almost people are too trusting sometimes of, I pulled this from Docker Hub, it must be fine, it must be okay. And I think you have to, as an organization, kind of establish a definition of trust, of whose images are we going to trust. You can kind of have your own rules of, I trust things from Netflix, I trust things from Google, certain developers that I know through the community, having those definitions of trust versus I pulled this because it was from user ABC123, sounds good. And then once after that, what are the sets of checks that you're going to put in place to establish that trust? Are you going to do scanning? Are you, what are you having to make sure that at deploy time also this image wasn't tampered with between the time you pulled it and deploy time? And so I think that's one of the big things around the growth of open source, is that you get a lot more contributions, but you need to start looking at where are they coming from and what are they, and do I trust them? And with Docker images in particular, I know Dirk Handel from VMware, he's the head of open source there. He's really been pushing the Turn project, because one of the other things is that images can pull other images that can pull other images. So you can kind of have a chain, both from a licensing perspective, but also potentially a vulnerability perspective.
And so
that's a problem.
Yeah. So Anne, in terms of where the fix should exist, then is it the maintainers that should be more careful about which whose other containers they pull in, or other layers that they pull in? Is it the user that needs to be careful about which images they say? You mentioned about the publisher, for example, which is a little bit easier perhaps on Docker than it is maybe something like you're looking for a package on an application repository or something like that. Where do the fixes lie, or is it kind of across multiple places?
I mean, in some ways it is across multiple places. We all have to kind of do our best effort. But I think at the end of the day for this one, it does sit in back to that shift left in the developer and putting the security checks in place of, if you're going to pull something in, you need to have a process to establish why you did that and how you trust it.
I really like this going into this supply chain attacks. Go ahead, Josh, because I think we have a lot of stuff to say on this.
Yeah, I was going to carry on supply chain attacks because I think it's a really interesting problem. It's a very difficult problem. I mean, in terms of whose responsibility is it? I think, like Anne says, it has to come back to the development organization. You can't necessarily rely that someone upstream is going to worry about this. I mean, if you look at, was it the event stream example? I can't remember exactly which example it was, but there was a sub-library of a sub-library or something where the maintainer just sort of got bored of maintaining it. Someone asked him, "Oh, can I take over maintenance of this package?" He's like, "Oh yeah, sure, I can't bother with this anymore." Transferred over ownership of the package. And then suddenly, when it was discovered, he suddenly got a lot of heat. And he was like, "Look, I'm not being paid for this. This is sort of my hobby. I got bored of this." This guy had sort of been had been submitting patches or whatever to this library, so I didn't see any problem in transferring over ownership to him.
Yeah.
And you can say, okay, well, it was irresponsible to transfer that ownership. But again, the guy wasn't being paid to do this. It wasn't. He didn't have any sort of contract. There was no sort of guarantees he was offering. He was just one guy sat committing code to GitHub and into a registry. So it is going to come back to ultimately organizations that are using this code have to sort of be a buyer beware approach, or I suppose a downloader beware approach. To say, okay, well, where's this actually coming from? Where's this started?
I love that story because I think, like you just pointed out, there's a lot of open source sauce into this, right? This is kind of the stuff that open source is built from. The idea of accepting contributions, mentoring other people to own your project and, help you contribute. So, they are very empowered to take some project and, while you are maybe continuing your journey with something else. And this story sheds a lot of light into, how open source is both amazing, but also, has its kind of downfalls with stuff like, social engineering in this kind of way. It's an interesting story, or problem space to figure out. As there's no one person to blame on how this happened, right? That there's multiple ways both developers, consuming a library, should they have had some kind of tooling or some kind of policies to vet their packages before they upgrade, before they install or whatever? Should the registry have noted this kind of ownership change and, maybe had alerted or, had required someone to use a some major change just to reflect the fact that, something has changed? There's a lot of interesting talks around it. I can share from the Node Foundation side is there's actually a funny story around it. There's been so the Node Foundation is built around different working groups. There's a top level technical steering committee, community committee, different working groups all together. And one of the things is there's a working group called package maintenance, which has existed for actually quite a while before the event stream story. And it was really about this. How do we make open source maintainable, right, successful? Because you can't expect people to be, as they volunteer. I think the majority of open source is, volunteer based, and you can't expect people to be committed to that, 24/7, etc. So when they want to move on, with other projects, how do we make it sustainable so that the project is kept alive? A really good example of that, or at least a very pure example of that, is we had in NPM also the story of LeftPad, and a maintainer that got I would say it very easily upset with how things were done, and he just pulled a lot of his code, which actually broke so many systems around the ecosystem, because everything was kind of well, not everything, but so many projects were dependent on it. And so how do we make that sustainable? How do we make that work? How do we do that? And the event stream was a catalyst to bringing the package maintenance working group back to life. And there's a lot of, if you would go, if this is of interest to anyone who's listening, there's a lot of really good ideas and processes and policies that are now being put into this for the Node Foundation. So at the very least, we can be, very hopeful for things to be, I don't know if solved, but better working in the future.
I think it's worth reminding our listeners that open source maintainers are only human. You know, we put up a lot of nice polish around our projects, but at the end of the day, we're only human, and things like turnover and burnout happen just as they would, you know, inside employees in an organization. And so I think as you're consuming open source, you have to keep continually asking yourself, can I contribute back? And maybe the answer is not right now, but then the next day it might be, yes, I can offer that community X, I can offer them Y. It's sort of, that's what makes this whole process work.
No, very much so. I think that people see necessarily open source as, okay, well, it's there, it's free, I can just use it. I think they don't necessarily realize that, okay, maybe there's no monetary cost involved in that directly, that maybe there's a time investment, or maybe you want to be volunteering some time back to actually, you know, give back to that. I think that if it's seen as a purely, you know, take process where people just use open source materials, then you end up in this situation where they suddenly have feel some sort of entitlement and say, okay, well, why isn't this working? You need to go and fix this now. And like, well, this is my hobby. I do this on Sundays when I've got my day off. I mean, like I said, I'm on the board of OWASP, and we sort of see similar issues. I mean, OWASP is an organization that's dedicated to producing free application security resources for anyone to use. And it's been around must be coming on for 17, 18 years now, something like that. And people just sort of assume that it's this big, massive body. I mean, the best example I've seen of that was the year before, 2017, when the latest version of the OWASP top 10 risks came out. So the 2017 version of the top 10 web security risks came out, and a lot of people got very angry because they said, okay, well, this new item on the list is just the maintainers of the project trying to sell their product. And there was a big row about it, and the project leaders ended up standing down. But one of the things they said was, look, you know, this OWASP top 10 project that's referenced in, you know, regulatory standards and all sorts of things that's been around for so long, broadly speaking, is two guys volunteering their time, sitting down, gathering data together, and coming up with how they see it. And it just so happened the two guys who were working on it both worked at a company in a particular space, and therefore, you know, naturally their point of view was shaped by where they were working. And, you know, people saw the OWASP top 10 as this massive monolithic standard that had to have, you know, complete integrity and be completely pure. But broadly speaking, it was two guys who were just giving their time to do it. Mm-hmm. And then afterwards, they changed who the maintainers were, and then there were 4 leaders, and they made a very open process, put everything in GitHub, gathered data from all sorts of sources. And even after they released their work, people still came back and said, okay, well, why is this like this? Why is this like that? And they just came back and said, look, you know, this has been in GitHub for 6 months. It's been open for comment. You could have opened issues. People have opened issues. People have opened comments. You know, there's no point coming back now and saying, well, why is this like this? You could have said this 2 months ago, added an issue, and something might have happened. So it's very much about, I think, maybe shifting a mindset here, saying, okay, we have all these open, free resources, but there's a responsibility that comes with that of giving back to that as well.
And I'd love to, and staying on this point as well, I'd love to, we have about 10 minutes left. I'd love to finish with some actionable recommendations and suggestions for web developers and others to be able to take away and actually improve their day-to-day general security practices. Now, Josh, you mentioned OWASP is you know, a great resource for education for developers in general. What specifically we talked about the OWASP top 10, which is actually the previous session, which Jim Manico very actively with a big knife and some spray, and if you have to watch that session again. But Brian's still shaking about that. He was still giving Brian some counselling about that session. But what are the kind of things what are the top things in OWASP that you would recommend people you know read, and also in general, what if you could give like a few pieces of advice to developers, what would you say they should do?
So from an OWASP perspective, like I said, the top 10 risks are, I suppose, the most popular, well-known project, and that's something that's been around for, I'd say, probably almost as long as OWASP has been around. And the idea behind that document is to raise awareness. It's about saying, you know, here are the top 10 things that are going to give you a bad day. We're not necessarily aiming this directly at developers. We're just aiming this as a general awareness at all levels, and it's sort of seen as more of a management level document. And then the document that Jim was talking about last week is the top 10 proactive controls, which is sort of a response to the OWASP top 10 in some ways. It's saying, look, These are the top 10 risks. These are things that are going to ruin your day, but let's think about how we empower developers slightly more, and you give them a slightly more positive way of thinking about it, not saying, okay, these are the bad things that are going to happen. They're going to say, okay, these are the good things you should be doing. So the proactive controls is sort of a nice starting point of 10 areas that developers might want to be thinking about from a security perspective. And then if we sort of get more in depth than that, there's the application security verification standard, which is another document that is very, very detailed and sort of goes into sort of line by line controls that developers should be thinking about when building into their applications. We recently released version 4 of that document, the ASVS, and I was involved in that as well. The other thing that OWASP does is it has sort of actual projects you can play with. It has various funnable applications. So I think Liran mentioned earlier Node.js, if I'm not mistaken, which is an application written in Node.js with a lot of known vulnerabilities. Another one which is also written in Node.js by coincidence, but is very, very, very advanced, is the OWASP Juice Shop, which is a very realistic sort of e-commerce style application where you can buy juice, but it's also got a very large number of different vulnerabilities. So that's something that anyone can download, set up in Docker container, set up in Heroku or something like that, and start trying to find vulnerabilities and practice their skills. And maybe they've read something about XSS, they can start trying to exploit XSS in this application, or or other different vulnerabilities they may have heard about. So really there are lots of different resources that OWASP offer. Generally, there'll also be OWASP local chapters all around the world. We've got one here in Israel. I know in the UK there are lots of different cities that have London, Bristol, Cambridge, Newcastle, all sorts of different around the country that meet at least once every 3 months, I think, and they'll have speakers talking about different topics around security and application security. So those are also really good places to meet other people who sort of have an interest in security but don't necessarily work in security. Overall, OWASP tends to aim more at the developers. It's not designed to be a hardcore security, let's go and break and hack stuff. It's more of, okay, how can we fix this? Certainly if you look at the OWASP conferences, for example, the lineup for OWASP conferences is very much developer focused, very much, okay, here's how we fix this particular problem. Here's an idea of how you can go back to organizations and do this. You don't necessarily see the sort of, here's how we broke this thing completely, or here's how we took this webcam and shredded it. It's very much, okay, here's how we try and solve this problem. And the global conferences as well have training courses attached to them. So we've got the global conference coming up in Tel Aviv, like I said, at the end of May. And that's 3 days of training, most of which are aimed at developers or people working in R&D teams. And after that, the 2 days of the conference itself, that training is very much designed to cover all sorts of different topics. There's training for developers who are maybe new to security, training for security professionals who maybe have a little bit more experience and want to learn more advanced web hacking techniques. There's a training course about DevSecOps, how to integrate security tools into the continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline. There's a course about containers, all sorts of different topics that are focused around application security and product security. The training courses do cost money because we've got trainers flying over to give their time for that. But really the global conferences and the training courses attached are really the only things that with OWASP that directly cost money. You can be a member and it costs not very much a year. But there's really a whole wealth of different information there. So I'd say if people are interested in getting more involved with that, try and find out about your local chapter, try and find out who's involved locally, and meet people, and they can definitely point you in the right direction. Or
huge amount around the education of developers there is key for you there. Anne, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I would say from the container security side, I would be remiss not to mention that we have a series called Exploring Container Security on the GCP blog. And it's not just Google Kubernetes Engine specific, it's broader about the space. And I think if people just have the mindset of, I'm going to make an effort to kind of be this informed consumer that we were talking about, with making sure I'm receiving information about patches with regards to containers, reading up on what's going to work for my organization, what's going to work for our architecture. I think if you just start with the mindset of strict containers may not necessarily be the most secure option for me, you're in a good spot if you're at least considering that. Beyond that, a lot of the container security work revolves around either the OCI or the Kubernetes communities. There's lots of other orchestration tools, but Kubernetes kind of is it's the whirlwind of the hub. So if you start hanging out around the Kubernetes security channels and community, you'll start getting some answers there. In general, for both open source maintainers looking for more security expertise as well as consumers, the communities are friendly, and where people, particularly in security, really want to help and share information. So if you just reach out on, IRC or Slack or wherever the community hangs out and just ask, "I want help," you will find an answer.
Okay, awesome, thank you. And Liran, why don't you finish us off, Liran, with some? In fact, didn't you recently wrote a Docker cheat sheet, right, of some security tips in there?
True. I love where this was coming from. So yes, so I wrote a couple of those cheat sheets. One of them is Docker images security with the help of Omer Levi-Hevroni from Soludo, and also an NPM security best practices as well with Juan Picado. He's the core maintainer over Bertucio, and both of them are really around, you're using these tools, you're using, building Docker images, you're using NPM daily, but there are some really good security practices that you should follow. So, just look up for those. We'll probably mention them later in the channel, just to give you some resources. And I also wanted to give, I think Josh and Anne did a great job at giving several perspectives of how to kind of get started with security. I want to give the developer side of it, which is, I would say what worked for me, at least as a team lead for previous companies I've worked at, is if you can have one of the team members out of the whole, R&D developers teams, assuming that, a large enough will to work on, having, empowering one of them at least to be a security champion, to be someone who would advocate for security, goes really a long way. It's a great plan to, get the organization around, security practices. So, it's both empowerment, you win all of it. It's empowerment for engineers as well as security, knowledge into the team and bringing that in. So I'm happy also to help with that if anyone has any questions on how to make that work.
Awesome, thank you very much. And for anyone watching, if you wanted to take a look at the State of Open Source Security report in much more depth, there's about 50 or 60 pages. You could, it's linked in the live session chat on Slack. If you're not on Slack, please do join Slack and then click that link. If you don't have the RAM to start Slack, then you can go to snyk.io/State of OS Security, and there's a free ungated PDF there for you as well. So yeah, it just leaves me to say a massive thank you to Anne, Josh, and Liran for joining us today. And back over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Simon. And yeah, to echo that from Simon, thank you so much to the panelists, as well as you, Simon, for such a great discussion. I definitely really enjoyed it. So as I said, that's all we've got time for today. If you do have any more questions, please pop it on the Slack and I'll try to get those answered for you. Hopefully we'll have the panelists on a future session on the Secure Developer. So hopefully this is not the last time we see them. But if you did enjoy that, want to rewatch or anything, it will be on the website in a couple of minutes. If you give me a couple of minutes. And the session with Jim Manico on the OWASP Top 10 Proactive Controls is there as well. So if you haven't watched that already, check it out. Our next session will be in 2 weeks' time. It'll be Why Can't We Build Secure Software with Tanya Janko on the 28th of March. So sign up for that. We'll be meeting.
Tanya's awesome. Everyone should sign up to that. Tanya's awesome.
She's amazing.
Yes, very much so.
And yeah, if you enjoyed it, please share with your colleagues or your friends, or hopefully they're your friends and your colleagues. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Another mention is obviously the Secure Developer is brought to you by Snyk. Our aim is to create a vendor-neutral space to share knowledge and best practice about security. So if you'd like to get involved or anything like that, please let me know. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's really great.
Thank you, everyone.